Guys, welcome back. I hope you had a good Christmas and a Happy New Year. I hope your New Year was better than mine. Ignore this. Had a little bit of an issue. So the next video you're going to see from here is a 3-minute cinematic I had ready to go for my season finale video. We were going to see the motor run for the first time, do a bunch of checks, talk about what the next step was, maybe look at the new project car. But unfortunately, we had a setback. We had I'm going to say it was a mechanical failure. The engine did start and run and then shut off. Now, the next part is there's no physical damage to the engine. It's honestly one of those 1 in a million fluke things. One problem caused another problem and now the car will not run, but there's no damage. So I'll explain further on, and it took about 7 days to figure out what the issue was, between me disassociating and taking it and just going and doing something else instead of working on the car. So we do have to go back in to the engine slightly, nothing too crazy, and make a repair, but nothing mechanically was done incorrect. Again, this is a fluke. But it's just our luck something like this would happen. But the engine's okay, so I can stop being sick to my stomach, because you're about to see what I experienced, and it has not been a good 7, 8 days. I figured out what the issue was on Friday the 7th, and that was about exactly 1 week from New Year's Eve when this first happened. So I hope you enjoy the video. I'm just gonna get it out of the way. Spent a lot of time making it, and like I said, we'll move forward from this, and I get to show you a few other little tips and tricks on engine building and repairs now, so that'll be kind of neat. So I hope you enjoy. Whew. All right, guys.
All right.
Alright guys, so this is the long part. Gonna do a lot of talking with some video inserts here and there. I've even had to make notes. I almost just didn't make a video on any of this. I was gonna jump straight to it, but I think it's important that anybody interested in doing this type of work to really any vehicle, things go wrong, whether you, no matter how correct, how long you take putting something together, how careful you are, things can go wrong. You don't want to beat yourself up over it. You just want to move forward, figure out what the issue is, learn and develop good troubleshooting steps, and figure out what the problem is. We're just going to start from what we just saw. So, bang, engine shuts off. First action I made after that was what any well-adjusted human being's going to do. I'm going to try to start it again, and of course I got a clunk. You know, why wouldn't I? So my first impression, engine's locked up. Great, I'm an idiot. What did I do? What didn't I do? I get out of the car. I put my good old ratchet on the pulley, expecting the worst. I turn the motor over, and it's free and feels as good as it ever has. I'm like, well, that's weird. I had a first few impressions. I thought it kind of sounded like upper end problems. It sounded maybe a lifter. I thought maybe one of the roller rockers, the little roller, the trunnions on the roller, maybe one of them came apart. Maybe a lifter hung because it didn't have enough oil pressure, and it was, I don't know. I was thinking about a lot of little things. I was like, maybe the chain drive came apart, because it's all brand new components, but the chain drive seemed a little sloppy to me. But anyway, so my mind's racing with what could have that possibly been, because the motor locked. It shut off. It didn't just shut off with a warning. It locked up, but it didn't lock up. The motor was fine. It didn't lock up. I did one full rotation. Made sure the damper was back on its mark, top dead center. I'm thinking, well, I'm rotating the motor. I'm not feeling anything. I'm not hearing anything. Again, that's not necessarily telling me anything. So I go back in the car and I decide, well, let me crank it again and see what happens. So I get like a crank and a half out of the starter. So I'm like, okay, well, that's still not telling me anything. Like, so what's going on now? Like, maybe there's something wrong with the battery, or the electrical, or well, I'm still thinking there's something wrong with the motor. I'm thinking, okay, I was able to turn it over by hand, but maybe there's something that's causing that much of a drag on the starter, something internal. I start pulling the top end apart for what I can without taking the valve chest, the cam chest off. Pulling the CCV module. I'm pulling the covers off. I'm rotating the engine over. I'm watching the cams move. I can see the counter shafts move through the water pump. I had to take the intake off. There's a little vent on the backside of the water pump pulley drive that the counter shaft drives the water pump, and I can see the counter shafts moving. I'm not feeling anything weird in the chain drive. I can feel the tensioners rebounding. I'm thinking, okay, so and I can look down in there. It's like, okay, the chain drive's okay. The cams are okay. Everything's moving freely. So I pull the plugs out. I'm like, let me pull the plugs out and see what's going on. I go in the car to try to start it. I get nothing but a click, and not a click from the Bendix on the starter. All I'm hearing is a small little click from the electrical, the relay inside the cab that energizes the low voltage circuit to the solenoid. All I'm hearing is that. Starter's just dead. I'm not getting any power to the starter now. I'm thinking, what now? You know, like, it's like nothing's making sense. Like, what just happened? So I decide, okay, well, I unhook the battery, I hook it back up, I clear all the codes with my scanner, and there were no codes. There was an engine speed code, but it seemed irrelevant at the time, so I just, of course you're gonna get an engine speed code when it shuts off abruptly. So I had cleared everything, and I'm trying again. I'm like, I'm not getting anything to the starter. So I'm thinking, okay, I've spent about an hour and a half jacking with electrical and inspecting everything that I can find, and I decided, okay, let's pull this starter motor off and see what the heck is going on. I pulled the starter motor off, and that's when I find it's just completely it sounded and felt like a coffee can full of marbles. The starter was trashed. So then I think to myself, I was like, I bet that's what happened. It hung, it hung, the Bendix stayed out, and when the engine turned over, it took the starter with it and was spinning the starter way faster than it was designed to go. And you can almost hear it in the video with all the other sounds going on. You can almost hear that high-pitched noise. So the starter hung and then seized up, because I did take the starter to and had them test it 10 different times. It was completely toast. I mean, you could try to turn it and then it would lock and then turn, and then you could shake it, and it was trashed. So I'm thinking, okay, well, this starter, and I'm thinking, oh great, that's what the problem was. That's what the noise was, the starter. I was like, man, awesome. I come back, I have my remain starter, I install it, I leave everything unhooked. I'm trying to, I was like, let's take this one step at a time. I put the remain starter back on. The plugs are still out. Everything I have disconnected, still disconnected. I just, okay, let's crank this over now and see what happens. And you see the video. So it turned over like butter without the plugs in. So I'm like, oh man, it was just the starter the whole time. The motor's not locked up. I've still had a little cautious optimism on this from the very beginning. I was like, every time I kept thinking I had it, I was like, maybe not, So I put it all back together. Plugs in, I put it all, oh yeah, we got it. It was the starter. Let's put it all back together, because I'm smart. So, and now this happened.
So now I think the battery's freaking dead.
Oh, the battery's dead, right? Of course. How easy would have that been? So I charge it up about roughly an hour and a half, 2 hours, and I come back in here, I'm recording, and then I try it again, and
Man, that is weird.
So now I'm confused. I'm dead certain the battery's okay, but I don't have x-ray vision, I don't have a crystal ball. Maybe the battery's not okay. Maybe when the starter hung and burned up, maybe the circuit held open or something, and maybe kind of backfed and screwed up the battery. Maybe it's got a bad cell. Maybe it burned up a wire. I mean, I'm thinking maybe something else happened electrically, because all we did essentially is put the plugs back in and increase the load back to the starter, and now it can't handle the load. It'll turn it over like butter without a load, but the minute you put the plugs in, it's just chug, 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 and it can't seem to turn it over. So I'm thinking electrical issue. So I start doing my checks, and before I deem the starter bad, I have this is a old school, you can get these pretty much anywhere, great little tool to have, even on this new stuff. It's roughly a 100 amp resistor, it puts a 100 amp draw on a circuit. It's got a coil in here that glows red after about 10 seconds or so, and you have a little meter. You can watch the draw, you can watch it drop if there's weak current and it can't hold it, it'll start dropping. So this is a great little tool to have. They're like 50-60 bucks. So I put this just on the battery for now. I put this just on the battery. Battery's fine. I'm thinking it's not the battery. So I'm messing around, looking for electrical issues, and then all of a sudden it hits me. I'm like, what's all we did? All we did was put the plugs back in. I mean, so all we did, what happens when you put the spark plugs back in? You're returning what to the cylinders? Compression. And then I thought it's almost like it's got too much compression. It jumped timing. That's what happened. It jumped timing. So I tear this cover off. It's over there now. I put the damper on the mark. I come up here. I get my dial caliper out. I put it on the marks. I'm thinking, I measure from the center over, and I put it on there. I'm like, oh yeah, this thing jumped timing. That's what that noise was. That's why it shut off like it did. It jumped timing with the starter. And I still figured, hey, the starter had something to do with it. It's like, oh, it jumped timing. Well, I put everything on there. I do my check, and it's dead on. I'm thinking, okay, well, like, damn it. So I rotate the motor over, one full rotation again. I double check everything. It's still in time. So the motor's still in time. It's like, okay, well, that wasn't it. So then that was frustrating. So I have a worst case scenario in my brain that's been taken away, and I've been ignoring it. We'll get to that here in a minute. So I dismiss a timing issue. It's in time. I've dismissed the starter. It's brand new. It's a reman, but it's brand new and it's obviously working. I'm dismissive of the circuit. Well, I wasn't dismissive of the circuit yet. I was dismissive of the battery, but now I drew my attention back to the battery. I'm like, what else can it possibly be? It's electrical. It's got to be electrical. There's not enough current to the starter. It's drawing too much or not enough or whatever the heck is going on. At this point, my brain is scrambled. So I take my battery, I put it on a 10 amp charge overnight. I bring it to work. We've got some fancy $1,000 Midtronic scanner that can test for bad cells and do a load and all this stuff. That battery is 110% healthy. It was an 800 cranking amp battery. It pulled up 838 cranking amps. It's fine. So I'm thinking, great. So and I was stubborn, and on the way home, I bought a jump box anyway. About 300 something cranking amps. It says 630, but great little tool to have around anyway. I don't actually have one of these. I used to. So now I'm thinking, okay, battery's good. I hooked this up that night. I got home, put the battery back on. I put this on the jump posts. The car has jump posts. I put this on the jump post. Same thing. Make no difference. It just lugs and chugs away. And then the starter starts to smoke, by the way. That's the other thing I forgot to mention earlier. Every time this thing does its chug, 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 it starts to, after about the fourth or fifth rotation from the starter, the ground wire starts to smoke a little. So I'm thinking, maybe it's a loose ground. I had checked I checked them by hand earlier. I'm thinking, oh, the grounds are fine. The car just cranked and cranked and cranked and started just a couple days ago. Why would the circuit suddenly now be no good? But so I was a little dismissive of that at first. So then I decide, okay, well, let's readdress the circuit. I pull all the ground wires off. I double check all the positive cables from the battery. I pull the trunk apart, check the battery, the ground on the positive and ground cables on that, all the way up to this firewall portion here where the jump posts are. I even added a second ground cable. I had an old higher, like a 200 amp rated ground for an inverter, and it fit just perfectly. So I installed that. I do think one of the grounds was a hair loose on the where it bolts to the frame, but I took everything apart. I cut the insulators off the terminal ends, checked everything, put new insulation back on it, wire wheeled everything, put it back together. The grounds are shiny and good. I put it all back together and nothing. So I was like, okay, great. So now what? Now what? I'm back to nothing. I'm like, what is going on here? All I know is what's not wrong, presumably. I load test, I hook up this, like I said, it's a 100 amp draw. I put this right on the positive terminal of the starter, and I put this right on the body of the starter, and then I load test it, and it holds a load, it's glowing red. So I just load tested the circuit from the lug on the starter to the ground off to the starter body itself, and it held over. It dropped to maybe about 11.8 volts, but it held over like an 800 cranking amp rating, and it was glowing red for about 10-15 seconds. It held it. So I'm thinking the circuit's fine too. The circuit's good. I've been over this. There's not a problem in the circuit. So then my mind draws back to the starter I just got, thinking maybe this new starter, it's from a more reputable auto parts store, take a pick. They happen to have it in stock on New Year's Day. So, hey, let's just pay the brick and mortar tax and go get one. I'm thinking, man, it's a bad starter. I take it off. The reman starter wasn't as bad as the first one, but it feels like crap too. So in the back of my mind, I'm thinking one of two things. Either, oh wow, this was a bad starter. What kind of luck is that? Or I just caused it to do that, because I had probably tried to crank this about 10 different times off camera with the starter and the plugs in. So I had that starter, the second one, smoking for quite a bit at certain points. And You know, not on purpose, but it's like, okay, like I'm trying to troubleshoot. I have to try to get it to start. Like I don't have a choice. So I take that starter off. Like I said, it feels like crap. It's making noise. I'm like, okay, I got a bad starter. So I take it back to the auto parts store. They put it on their bench test. It passes. It smells bad and kind of sounds weird, but it keeps passing. But luckily, the guys at the auto parts store were like, yeah, man, because they felt it. They're like, man, yeah, something's wrong with this starter, so we'll get you a new one coming. So I picked up the new starter the next day, brought it back here. I put the new starter on. I double check what I can double check. And I let the plugs in. I had left the ECM fuse pulled. Everything, the coils unplugged, the actuators unplugged. I just wanted to hear this thing crank under load. I didn't want to keep filling the cylinder with fuel. So put the new starter on. This is the third starter on the car now. Get in the cab. I know the battery's good. Everything's good. I go to crank it. Same thing. Do, and it goes to smoking. I'm not giving up. I grab my jump box. I put it right on the studs. And of course now I have a fresh ground too. I'm like, there's no way. I'm putting this. So now I've got like about 1100, 1200 cranking amps worth of juice to this thing. Still 12 volts, but we just have a massive battery pack now because you got essentially a battery and a half versus one. I get in the car, I get a little bit, it goes a little faster. And I'm thinking, oh, that's almost fast enough to start, but it's still, that doesn't sound right at all. What is going on? And of course, then the starter and these goes to smoking so bad. I'm like, oh, God dang it. You know, I'm like, what is going on? You know, now I'm going to burn up the third starter. So at this point, I'm going to bring up my worst case scenario. My inclination was telling me there was a problem in the bottom end because it spins over like butter without the plugs in it. So what can you dismiss? All of your ancillary equipment, your alternator, your AC compressor, anything in the transmission, anything in the valve train, nothing. It spins over free. It turns over free. So all you're doing when you're putting the plugs back in is you're returning the load to crank. So I did not suspect a spun or rolled main bearing. That I would have been in denial of that until I tore the motor down. There was no clearance for a rolled bearing. The mains on this are tanged. They're machined. The caps are machined fit. Obviously they're numbered. Everything goes where it has to go. We measured the oil clearance. There's no room for this thing to roll a main. You know, challenge accepted for some engines, but the rods on this were what was worried me. The rods are fracture split and the bearing shells are not tanged and they're more or less just free floating. Once you torque the cap on, they're tight, but they fit in, but you have it's not a perfect machined fit. They're fracture split. So you have, when you're installing the bearing in the connecting rod side, you have a little bit sticking out past the mating surface of the opposing cap. So you have to kind of position everything in the cap to where it's sticking out just a little further on the other side and get everything to mate up. So you have to be very, very careful, and I made sure they were dead center. I measured on each side of the bearing to make sure it was perfectly centered on that in the journal. On the rod. I mean, I put this thing together with surgical precision. Dare I make a claim to that, but I really did super take my time putting this thing together. So, but the rods are a different story, like I just explained to you. And I had a bad feeling that possibly a rod bearing possibly spun and rolled. Now, what is the difference? When a bearing spins, it spins both shells and usually kanks over to one side. But what usually happens is a rod bearing will spin and then roll. What I mean by roll is the bearing shell will actually, a shell will come loose and actually roll into the other shell. So now you have like no bearing on the other side or half a bearing on the other side. It rolls into the other shell and you just have catastrophic failure. And if you remember, that is exactly what happened to the old motor. Now, I'm not saying that's correlating at all. This is a completely different crank and brand new connecting rods and bearings. It's essentially a whole different motor. The only thing we really reused was the block and a few other things, but it's got all different components from other donor cars. So that was my worst case scenario, and that was making sense to me partially because there's no load on it. It spins free, but the minute you put load on it, it just digs in. That metal just digs in and causes it to bind on the rod end, not the main, the rod. So that was my worst case scenario. I was definitely worried about that because then essentially I'd have to do this entire job over again, minus a few things, but I would have to pull this down to the crank all over again, and that would have sucked. And then I thought, well, how would have that happened? We know we measured the clearances, we know everything was good, but I was a little worried about I didn't make oil pressure fast enough. I thought I had reassembled the motor. It sat in here for a couple months. I drenched everything in assembly lube like you should. And I tried to prime everything best I could just by pouring oil into the orifices before I assembled certain things. And I tried everything I could to make sure this thing would build oil pressure as fast as possible. And I kept thinking maybe that's what happened. Maybe it didn't build oil pressure fast enough, and metal touched metal and it scored, and then once it finally did build oil pressure, but it just wasn't enough. Maybe it ground out some clearance. That was my assumption. So again, that's the worst case scenario. So I pull the plugs. Motor spins over like butter. I was like, I don't care. I stayed cranking on. I cranked it for I didn't record this part. Again, I had stopped recording, guys. I was just like, no, I need to figure something out. So I'm spinning and spinning and spinning. I want to see oil pressure. I want to see, and it shot right up. It shot up about 20 PSI cranking speed. Without the plugs in it, 20 PSI. So I let it sit there. I let it sit and crank away for about 10, 15 seconds, listening. I'm not hearing anything weird. I'm not hearing banging, clanging, ticking. I'm hearing just a motor. Thinking, okay, I'll give it a break. I tried again. This time I let it sit for close to about solid 15 seconds this time. Building oil pressure. Oh, it's making a mess over here. Don't care. I'm listening. Like, what? It sounds different, but I figure it's a different starter motor. I'm not hearing anything. So I'm building oil pressure, and again, at that point, I just stopped. I stopped for the day. I'm like, I had to just kind of disassociate from this whole thing. I'm like, I'm not figuring this out. I don't know what's going on. So there's one other thing. I thought possibly there are two starters that can bolt to this motor. There's a 1 kilowatt or 1.1. That's roughly 1 1/3 horsepower. There's also a 1.7 kilowatt starter, which is the equivalent of 2 1/4 horsepower. Now with everything, if you've been paying attention, does that not make a little sense? What's going on? Hey, the starter's too weak to actually turn the motor over on compression. That's what the problem is. I need a 1.7 kilowatt starter. The problem is the 1.7 kilowatt starters are designed for the diesels and the TTS, which is the 300 horsepower version of this. But exhausting all other options, aside from my worst case scenario, I was determined I'm going to put a 1.7 kilowatt starter on this engine and get it to run because I want to hear something. Surely, all of the times I tried to crank this thing with the plugs in it, at some point something would free up. It would try to start. It would do something, but it was such a consistent lugging. Nothing I did changed that. Nothing at any point sounded any different. And even if you have a rolled bearing, at some point it's going to free up slightly, change something. It'll start cranking real fast real quick, then go back to lugging. It'll do something like that. Not just a consistent do, and then you wait and do. It was so consistent. That's why I was starting to become dismissive of a lower end issue. but I was running out of options. I was about to buy a 1.7 kilowatt starter. I'm glad I didn't. It would have been a waste of money. I don't know what damage it may or may not have caused installing it. It would have fit. It would have plugged right up. But this is where the story kind of gets boring. I just got online and was just digging through forums, digging through just random research, and I was just looking at trying to get some kind of an idea from not just on these cars in particular, but just a general consensus of it spins without plugs, it won't crank with the plugs in, and everyone kept saying timing. I checked timing 800 times, it's fine. And then I got to, believe it or not, another one of the a Volkswagen Audi forum where somebody had a motor that hydrolocked, and they actually had the lobes spin on the cam. And I thought, oh wow, that's some shit luck. And then I thought about it, I was like, no, like that, there's no way. And I kept searching, digging. I'm like, I don't think that's what happened. I mean, this thing was it was barely idling. That's not what happened. So I was a little dismissive of that, but that kind of got me thinking. I'm like, I don't think that's even possible on these motors. And then I came across a very short YouTube video of somebody that had my exhaust cam on a table, and they had built some little jig, some little metal measuring device. He had a bolt. You can see the top dead center mark, maybe. He had a bolt on this eccentric, and it was pointed up, and then he had another bolt welded to it, and it was basically him realigning the sprocket onto his camshaft. And the point of that was, what he said was this. He said, when the motor abruptly stopped, without any other detail, he said, yeah, when this motor abruptly stopped, this freaking sprocket spun on the damn cam. And it was like way over here, but I have this and I put it back to this. But, you know, I just stopped listening at that point. I'm like, son of a bitch. I was like, no. I was like, there's no way. So I come out here. This is the cam off the old engine. I come out here. I rotate it to top dead center. As far as the timing mark, I put the timing mark top dead center. I hold this top dead center. I look at these lobes. I look at those lobes. And we have a problem. So the motor is technically in time as far as our markings and our measurements on our timing marks when we put our damper on TDC. I've advanced this to where we can see it better, but right now, if you'll just bear with me and we'll look at this timing mark first and the position of that lobe. That's your low lift and your high lift. I know it's kind of hard to see the difference because there's lube on it, but that's your number one exhaust valve, your low lift and high lift lobe on your Audi valve lift, your sliding cam. So roughly, just ballparking this, let's say 0 is TDC on the as far as the profile on the cam. Let's say we're at about 40 degrees, reading that gauge backwards. So you'll pay close attention to the position of that lobe. So this is a known good cam out of the old engine. It's still good to be reused, but we're going another route. So if you'll pay close attention to the position of those, and we'll look back down at this one. And then back up here, you'll notice something's a little bit off. Again, 0 degrees, we'll say with 0 degrees is top dead center on the profile. This is just approximations. We'll say that lobe is at about, this is 120 degrees. It's actually a little bit, maybe about 130 degrees. So we're between 80 and 90 degrees advanced. Why do I say advanced?
This motor, in orientation we're standing, spins clockwise. And when the starter locked the crank down, obviously that stopped the chain, that stopped the sprocket, that stopped everything dead in its tracks for the most part. And what happened was the camshaft had enough momentum to spin in the sprocket. So the cam advanced in the sprocket, not the other way around. And that's what happened, guys. The good news is, guys, there is absolutely no contact for the valves. We'll see that next.
Alright guys, we're in the combustion chamber of number 1. Most importantly, we're not seeing any bent valves. It would be very obvious. I've got a mirror attachment on my bore scope, which allows me to do this. So we're looking at the highest point of the valve in the combustion chamber, and we're not seeing any contact. Possibly it may have kissed the piston just a hair, but I honestly doubt that even happened. We're moving into number 2 now. Same thing. We're looking for any contact marks. We're just not seeing anything. We're looking at one of the, again, this is the exhaust valve. We're going to move over to the other one here in a minute. You can see how clean it looks. Again, there's no damage whatsoever. We're moving out of number 2, going into number 3. Come on. And again, same thing. We can kind of see the line where our head gasket is. Obviously the pistons are farther down in the cylinder. You can see just a little bit of cross hatching here and there. Sorry about the jerkiness. It's kind of hard to do this. A little bit of copper coat on the top of the valve. It's no big deal. But again, it's very obvious that the valves have not came into contact. Oh, we're in number 4 now. So number 4, the valve the valves were open a little bit. So they can hear in a minute I go to turn the motor over and I go the wrong way. So the valve, oh, I think I already did. Yeah, I already did. So valve's coming back in. You can kind of see the piston, how close it's coming, which is really not that close at all. Again, we're very fortunate with the cam out of the orientation it's in. The valves did not make contact at all entirely. So we're going to look around at the valves now. This was just the valve closing. So again, the piston's all the way top dead center. Obviously the valves are fully seated for whatever reason. I want to say the cams actually are like close to 100% overlap right now for whatever. Coincidentally, I have to look, but again, the valves look fine.